Well, great. Well, let's go ahead and begin. So we have Steve here. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. And I'm going to offer a quick prayer, and then we'll offer Steve a brief introduction, and then he'll let him share more about what he's been up to and give us some thoughts. So just take a moment in the middle of our day to recollect ourselves. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we ask you humbly to lavish us with your Holy Spirit during this time, that we may grow holistically in your love and your light. May our minds and hearts and ears be anointed, and may you speak through Steve and his insights during this time. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Great. Well, Steve, thanks again for being here. I'll just offer a quick intro to Steve. Many of you know him already, but and hopefully he can share more of his journey and some of the work he's been up to. But he started Monk Manual, as you know, many of you know, it's a comprehensive planner for the whole person. It's in terms of its marketing and sales has done fabulously well, and it's just a wonderful tool. He funded it 100% on Kickstarter in about 4 hours, and before that he worked for Dynamic Catholic, and is just an entrepreneur at heart. I've got to know Steve recently through this competition, and just found him to be so thoughtful and reflective, prayerful, but also just a super go-getter. And so he's very much at home in this community. Was a semifinalist for the OSV challenge, so is part of the tribe, if you will. But Steve, if you want to just offer a few more just reflections on your bio and journey, and then share with us some of your thoughts on how to take care of ourselves as entrepreneurs. I mean, it's a tough ride, and there's a drive to just keep working and slogging it out, and a lot of the premier entrepreneurs say that. I was listening to talk from Elon Musk the other night, and it's like, you got to work 100 hours a week, and you want to start something. So how can we take care of ourselves holistically as children of God and as entrepreneurs in the faith?
Thanks, John. And thank you guys all for joining us today, or joining me, letting me talk to you. I was, when John reached out to me about this, I actually went back and I said, I don't know if I'm the exact right person to speak to this, because in many ways, even the Monk Manual, which is interesting because a lot of it's built off of this idea of being and doing. And I think one of the reasons it's effective is because it's actually playing out of my place of weakness, right? So I'm actually not naturally predisposed to be able to live in it with a sense of being, right? I'm more built to be a doer, and because of that, and because of my struggle in that, I think I've been able to feel out the edges of my weakness a little bit more, right? Like if any of you guys have ever had some sort of principal weakness or struggle you're dealing with, even if it's like a sin, for example, or something, right? If you really go and look at that thing and spend enough time with it, you start understanding it to a degree that you probably are able to then unpack and help other people who may be struggling with the same thing, maybe even to a lesser extent than you had. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today. And what I love about this is it's such a broad, kind of gigantic topic. And I am somewhat verbose, so I'll try and just get right into it and see where it goes. I do have some prepared thoughts, but to lead off, and this is something I don't really talk about that much. What's interesting is with the Monk Manual, I do serve a lot of Catholics, but I serve, I would say predominantly actually like a spiritual but not religious audience. And that's intentional. I'm really trying to, in a sense, bridge into an audience that maybe we as Catholics sometimes don't have as much of a bridge into. And for me, I feel personally called into that. But to understand my own background, I was an agnostic in college, had a really profound reversion to Catholicism through somewhat of like a supernatural grace or experience, right? And I imagine all of you who are on this call right now, devoting your life on some level to serving in the church, which means that on some level, you have been touched profoundly by God and God's grace in your life. And that was certainly the case for me. I was actually in a place where I was never actively suicidal or anything, but I was on I was in a place where I just didn't really feel like anything mattered as an agnostic, because the way I figured, I couldn't see why any of it would really matter. It just seemed like one big elaborate game. And what ended up happening is after my conversion, there was this real sense of, I don't want to say indebtedness to God, although there is that, but this sense of when you're feeling like you're drowning and you get like pulled out, there's a real urgency, right? Like a real urgency and passion to go and serve God in the gospel. And that's been with me since that time, right? And I think that because of that, tied to my own natural personality, I've been the guy who has a hard time sometimes slowing down, the guy who has a hard time with like self-care. I remember in one of my first jobs, which was in a ministry setting after college, there was a priest that I really liked who, after we had like a big victory, made a comment around like, you're like the type of person who like doesn't really want to like celebrate things, right? Kind of just like, all right, on to the next thing. And sometimes you just need to let the horse like eat and drink a little bit. He had some sort of analogy that I'm forgetting the exact context to, but that's who I am, right? Like and I'm not saying that's a predisposed, this is how I always have to be, but that's one of the things I have to work up against. And as I was thinking about this talk and time with you guys today, I was thinking, I'm probably not going to be the best person that you hear, but I'm hoping that I can be the most honest, right? So I value honesty very highly. And I feel like as a church, sometimes we struggle with just being honest and real with each other. As an entrepreneur, I know what many of you guys are going through, the fear that surrounds that, the self-doubt. It's an up and down roller coaster all the time, right? And every, there was a rapper named Puff Daddy from the 90s who had a song called Mo Money, Mo Problems. And that's actually real as well, right? And the more you get into these things, the heavier it is. With the Monk Manual right now, last year I was struggling to just like provide for my family. My wife stays home. I have 3 kids. The Kickstarter did really well, but even off of the Kickstarter, I was doing some consulting work. I really believed in the long-term vision, which I'm sure many of you guys do for your ideas, right? You think, man, I don't know how I'm going to win these next few battles, but I really think this is like a battle that over time I can win. And that was the position I was in. And that was really difficult. And now I'm in a situation that's very different. I mean, right now I'm up this month, almost 900% growth over last year, same time, right? For this month. And, but it's just totally different problems that are way heavier. There's some things I'm working through right now that are very, very difficult. It doesn't necessarily get easier. And that's why this idea of self-care, is so fascinating to me because, again, from my personality, but I think we also have a little bit of this that maybe comes out of our like Catholic guilt, where you hear self-care and you think, I don't know about that. That sounds a little frou-frou or a little bit self-indulgent or whatever that might be. So how does that work in a Catholic understanding, in a Catholic economy of our salvation and working in the church? And I think it plays a really integral role. And I think that as entrepreneurs, it's something that we have even more of a sense of urgency and pressure to work out because the demands on us are very high, both from a psychological standpoint, as well as from a spiritual standpoint, right? Because like really, if you bring the whole macro level of our belief of understanding of how these things work, if you really believe that your vision has been given to you by God, right? That God is in the mix with you, and that you're here for a definite purpose, trying to serve a definite cause, then we also have to believe that there's a correlating opposite force that's also trying to work against that, right? And maybe you've seen this in your own life already, whether it's explicit spiritual battles or maybe implicit ones. Those are all very real. And so what I want to offer today is just a few thoughts on some tangible ways I think that we can arrive at a better maybe understanding of what I think what an anthropology of self-care can look like for Catholics, specifically as entrepreneurs, but then also some tangible ways you might be able to implement some of those things. So one of the things that was a really core shift for me, and this actually happened prior to launching the Monk Manual, but I think it was one of the things that ended up giving me courage to go and do the Monk Manual. And not only courage, but maybe in some ways permission. And it's going to sound a little bit confusing because it's not explicit why this would be the case. But for a long time after my reversion experience, I had been operating out of this model of feeling like I needed to go and give back to God. Like I needed to go and work hard and be like a Leonardo da Vinci and like create my masterpiece, right? And things really shifted for me when I realized that I am not actually being called to create the masterpiece. Like I am the masterpiece that's being created, right? So there's a difference between our work being the end point and in our walk with God being our end point, or God's ultimate work in us being the end point. And when we can take this when we can take this model of maybe being and flipping it on its head, because our culture definitely does kind of propose us as this, as the work itself is our endpoint, then I think we're able to tap into something that other people might not have access to, and that's critically important. And I love the analogy of art specifically, and when I bring up like a Leonardo da Vinci, is because when you think of like a masterpiece, like if you understand or if you've studied art in any way, and I'm not trying to be pretentious by saying that, but in art, like the negative space is just as important as like the active space, right? Like there's a harmony amongst it, right? And in our own lives, God's not only working in this active space, but also in that more like negative space, that like passive space, right? And actually to create like something really beautiful, you have to have both. Otherwise it's frenetic, it's not really beautiful, right? And it's hard for us to see that because often as entrepreneurs, we're so in the midst of it. There's always a problem. There's always a task list. I had someone who talked to me when I was first starting the Monk Manual, who was explaining something along the lines of like, everyone dies with the to-do list, right? Like everyone does. And so like the problems, the to-do list never go away. And Jesus like even addresses this, like the poor will always be there, right? Like there's always going to be something. You could go and grow your company to be a $2 million endeavor. Maybe that's your goal. And then you're going to be thinking, how do I get this to 10? It's always going to be the next thing, right? And so when we focus things, or when we're able to at least anchor some of our experience and our focus on the external reality to what God might be doing in us, I think that's where a lot of the magic starts to happen. And earlier on, someone had mentioned Elon Musk, right? Or John, I think you had, right? About working 100 hours a week. And part of what led me to the Monk Manual was I became really obsessed with productivity, right? I really wanted to go and work earnestly for the gospel. And yes, I would follow some different spiritual teachers and mentors, but also like many Catholics do, if you want to go and learn about how to be more productive, you're probably not going to Bishop Barron, for example, or name XYZ Catholic figure, right? You're probably going to, I don't know, Tim Ferriss or some other person, right? Who's this productivity person or this business person or whatever it might be. And what I think is helpful is to recognize that a lot of our ways of actually interfacing as Catholic entrepreneurs have largely been informed by our heroes, which are oftentimes from the secular world. Now, from conversations I've had with John's done some really interesting work looking into a lot of the historical figures who have brought about renewal in the church, right? So these are trying to pinpoint like, okay, who are in some ways like the Catholic entrepreneurs we can really look up to. But for most of us who haven't had access to that sort of vantage point, we're looking at people like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or whoever that is. And we can see certain virtues that we really aspire to, but the economy upon which they're operating out of is not the same economy of living that we would be operating out of. So what's the difference? I think one large piece of that is seeing our lives as a mixture of both being and doing, right? And not that those are even necessarily opposing forces. And this is something that was a big kind of like shift for me is as a Catholic, we oftentimes, we have this amazing thing called the sacraments, right? And the sacraments are these incredible moments within our lives that are predominant channels for grace. Now, that's a great thing. But the flip side of that, or the shadow, the negative thing that can sometimes happen is we can fall into the trap of finding ourselves in like an event-based spirituality, right? Where we're operating in a sense where we have these moments where here's where God is in my life. God is when I go to mass. God is when I'm praying my rosary. God is when I'm doing this or that. Whereas all these other things are kind of like my active life, right? So you have this non-integrated kind of fractured way of doing things. Whereas, and this is one of the things that attracted me to the monks is a monk lives a very integrative spirituality. They know that like this call, and this is, I really believe this is true, like this call is as much a part of my spiritual life as me going to mass, right? Now, mass might be an elevated experience. It might be a unique experience, just like maybe going on a date or something with my wife is an elevated experience, or going on a vacation is an elevated experience with my family. But still, like all those little moments are still just as much a part of my life and relationship with those things. And so what happens is being, which is kind of a vague term, is my grasping at trying to reach out at the reality that the Christian promise, in from my perspective, or the promise of the incarnation, is that everything is transcendent, right? Everything has a transcendent reality, which is very much kind of in lines with like a theology of the body, where it's everything you're doing. Your work itself is not it's not an end as much as it is a means. This call itself is like a means. It's all working in this big divine economy, right? Together. And that's in some ways like a very radical shift, and it's very nuanced, because it's hard to see how many ways that plays out culturally when you're operating in a world that's based on like a post-enlightenment materialistic reality, and there's no real sense of transcendent, or that the transcendent is bottled up into these fractional ways. How that really informs our way of doing, and how that informs our way of experiencing life as itself, right? And I just want to suggest a few ways from like a self-care standpoint, which is also tied to productivity, of how that might be playing out, with some like practical examples or tools that maybe you can incorporate. So I believe that for an entrepreneur, when you think about self-care, there's really two primary levels of where that comes into play. And there's more than that, but this is kind of, to kind of simplify it. Like one is taking care of like the engine itself, right? Like one is just being good stewards of your energy, maintaining the actual, I guess, machine, as it were, right? Like being a good steward, and not pushing things to a limit where it's going to break something, right? Whether that's spiritually or psychologically or whatever that might be. And really the solution to that, I believe, is trust. I believe it's trust and it's faith. Like it's ultimately has to be grounded in faith. It also ultimately has to be grounded in this reality of, do I trust God or not? And that might seem like a simple way of framing it, but I do think it's actually that simple. Like it really comes down to, can I trust God that like to not like enough is a day's labor, enough is a day's work, and live in that, right? And I'm not perfect at that. I'm not even great at that. I'm progressing, right? Like, and that's just me being honest. Like it's a very hard thing to do. And I think as an entrepreneur, for some of us, that might actually be, I don't know what it is, but I think the personality of an entrepreneur, like that might actually be the path itself. Like the path, the entire spiritual path is a growth in trust for an entrepreneur, right? So I think that's one level of self-care. And then another level, which is related to that, is grounded in a sense of perpetual reflection, right? Which how does that fit into self-care? We live in a time that is very, 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 very frenetic. It's very frenetic, and it's very active. And because of that, what we hold up is often, again, these tangible outcomes, but also this sense of movement. We kind of almost worship movement itself as an idol, right? Like we'll go and we can set hundreds of different to-dos and all these different, maybe tangible things we can measure, and we can have a sense of movement all the time, right? We can fall into a trap of feeling like we're succeeding to the degree that we're moving. But movement is not actually akin to progress. In fact, sometimes movement can actually be moving us further away from the goal. If you're going 100 miles an hour in the wrong direction, you're actually getting further and further away from the goal. And so when you can establish this certain level of trust, and I apologize that this is all I'm more abstract than I probably should be, but this is how my mind works. So when we can ground ourselves in a certain level of trust, then kind of the sword that we do battle with every day is a perpetual state of reflection, in being able to live, in a sense, in a perpetual examine and in awareness of God's activity of what's going on. And I think this is critically important because not only on a self-care level is it important for us to be tapped into the source of all of our energy or inspiration or creativity, but also I really believe this. Like if we are not able to build what we're doing on the foundation of what God is calling us to, then we are on some level laboring in vain. And it's not as simple as something that, for anyone who's worked in a large organization, something that's maybe a little more mature, does like strategic planning. It's one thing to go and say, all right, here's our 3-year strategic plan, but like strategy doesn't actually work that way. It's not something that you go and set something and then you just like live into it. It's a dynamic process. There's all these different checkpoints all along the way. And so it's this perpetual state of being able to live in this state of reflection that is so important. So to give like a few different now like practical tools that I think might be helpful, and then maybe we'll go to like questions because I could just keep talking. I really encourage everyone, and this is kind of the bedrock of what I've tried to put together in the Monk Manual, but I'd actually heard a story about Father Mike Scanlon, who did something similar to this. He was the founder. I don't know, he wasn't the founder, but he was the president of Steubenville, and many people consider him a very holy man. But I had a friend once who saw him in like the Adoration Chapel before his day, or early in the morning, and he actually had like his calendar. He had his planner book, and basically would go in and actually like talk to God about like, okay, what do you want me to do today, right? Which is like such a beautiful thing in my mind. Because obviously he was called to a very active vocation, right? He was you can't run a university without being very active, and yet would actually go in and say like, okay, I'm going to try and listen to God, say, what do you want me to do today? Write that down. So there's some level of accountability, and then just like live into it. Right. And I really encourage you to do that same thing, to try and prioritize upfront, maybe just like the top 3 things, pick the number 1 thing, and say, if I just got one thing done today, this would be the most important thing, but here's like the top 3, right? Let that be a dynamic conversation with God, and then live into it, right? And trust that it's been worked out. Because I don't know if this is your experience, but one of the things that I had previously dealt with quite often was going to bed at the end of the day and being like, man, what the heck did I do today? Like, I feel like I didn't I know I didn't really get all the things done that I want to get done, but I don't even know what I did necessarily get done. And maybe it was the right thing, maybe it wasn't the right thing, but I just wasn't really being that intentional. And what I was so inspired by with the monks is like, how beautiful is it to think that from 10 to 11, you're supposed to be in like manual labor, and from 11 to 12, you're supposed to be at lunch. And like, there's no question in your mind of, well, maybe I should be hopping on this call right now, or maybe I should be, because it's already been worked out for them, right? We don't have that same benefit, right? I see Karina has a child on her lap, right? Like, we don't have that same benefit. There's all these different things that are vying for our time. But if we can work out and say like, okay, like I really think I have to work on these 2 things for the next like 2 hours, and I'm just going to trust that and live into it, and I'm just going to be there, right? I'm not going to be in the future. I'm not going to be in the past. I'm just going to be there. I think that is how God wants to work in our lives. The other part of that is then actually reflecting back, and whether this is a formal exam or not, but actually taking a look at your day and saying, what were the highlights for my day? Like, not only in terms of the work you accomplished, but also just like in general, what were the highlights? And then like, when were you at your best? And these questions do a few different things. One is it can really help to institute a level of gratitude in your life and awareness. But simultaneously, especially the question of like when I was at my best, it's going to help you to understand not only where maybe you are living like virtuously and see like the goodness that's within you or how like God's operating in your life, but also the particular ways where you specifically are really engineered to thrive. I had an experience when I was at Dynamic Catholic where I messed up on a project. I could argue whether I messed up or I was set up to mess up or whatever it was, but let's say I messed up. I do believe I messed up on some level. But afterwards, I had a little bit of a brand of, well, Steve's maybe just not like a project manager. And my natural reaction, right? My ego was like, that's not true. Like, I'm definitely a project manager. I know how to do this. So I ended up going and being like, I know what I'll do. I'll go and get project management certification, because then I'll definitely know project management more than anybody, right? And I started working through that. I mean, I really spent maybe like 30 hours working on that. And then at a certain point, I was like, man, what a waste of time this is. It's such a waste of time. Not only, like, maybe could I do that? Yeah, maybe I could do that. But I don't even really want to do that. Like, I'm just doing that out of a place of insecurity. And I'm never going to really thrive in this area, right? Like, this is never going to be the thing that's God's like uniquely engineered me for. So like, why am I trying to do that? And it's probably taken me close to 10 years of my like working life to come to terms with the fact that like, yeah, there's probably like a handful of things, maybe like 5 things where I'm really good at these things. Like I truthfully, I'm pretty good at these things. And everything else I'm not that great at. Like I can do it, but I'm not that great at. And figuring out what those things are is really important. And it's also in some ways a form of trying to move, maybe not in a micro way, but in a macro way towards greater and greater self-care. Because I think when we're operating in a place of our strengths, I mean, in the secular world, they call it like flow, right? But like we're in like a state of flow, and we're there's something that's going on there, right? Like I would believe that there's something we're connecting to within ourselves with God, our creator, that's taking place there. And I do think that's what God desires for us. And then lastly, I just want to mention that probably one of the most critical aspects of self-care is actually, in a sense, like asceticism. It's like the ability to say no. In asceticism, like sometimes I think it's hijacked to purely mean like a penitential mea culpa. We need to go and fast because of this or that, right? And there's certainly a case to be made for penance, right? And what that can do to us. But I actually think that the genius of asceticism is the genius of creating space for like the greater yeses. And ultimately it's really taking seriously the idea that one of the most important things, one of the most important duties for us is to focus on the most important things. We sometimes can think in a polar way of, well, I'm either doing something good or I'm doing something bad. But while we're never going to be perfect at it, it's also the case that often our greatest distractions from doing the best thing or the thing that's our true, like, number one good is not going to be like the bad thing. It's going to be the things that are not quite the best thing or not quite the good things, but still crowd out us being able to do the really important thing, right? And so getting really ruthless, in a sense, with saying no to things that aren't the most important, I think is a critical. It's a critical skill set for an entrepreneur specifically to adopt, because we all have limited time. I imagine that everyone in this group, I mean, you all have like incredible aspirations right now, hoping to get $100,000 and grow something. And whether that happens or whether it doesn't, I imagine most of you are going to be continuing on with this vision you have. And you're probably going to be in a situation where the task ahead of you is not enough for you to just do on your own, right? There's going to be things you're going to have to compromise on. And you're going to have to say no, and being able to work out what those things are is critically important. So two things I would suggest around that. The first is something that actually comes from Warren Buffett. There's a story of Warren Buffett who's talking to his pilot who asked him some questions, or he was talking to him about like, what are your dreams for the future? What do you want to do? And Warren Buffett told him to write down a list of like, okay, what are your top 100 goals or something like that, right? And so we wrote it down, and he's like, okay, now rank them. And he ended up like ranking them. And then he said, okay, well, so like, what are you going to do with this? And I'm paraphrasing some of this story, but the spirit of it will remain. He says like, okay, well, what are you going to do? And he's like, well, it's good. I have like this list now, and I can start like working through it. And he's like, no, what you need to do is like commit to these top 5. And then like the next 25 have to be moved to like a runaway as much as possible list. Because those next 25 things are actually the things that are most likely to get in the way of you achieving those top 5 things. And you can do that on a macro level and do that for, hey, here's my 5-year vision. You could do that on a micro level with here's what I'm doing this month. You could do that on a micro level with here. Actually, it's probably not worth doing every day. But that can bring a lot of clarity. And then the other piece is, because one of the things with the Monk Manual that I kind of like have in my marketing language is that like the most important thing from a productivity standpoint isn't like doing more. It's really like focusing on the most important things. And the flip side of that I don't talk about that much, or I haven't traditionally, is that like that sounds great, but it's actually very, very difficult to do. Because it's very difficult, not only in the real time to not be drawn into these things, right? Because fear will make us focus on things that maybe aren't the most important, but also even just like working out what those most important things are. And so this is really a macro exercise that I'd encourage you to do, because I think it gets to the root of like super meta. A lot of, and as entrepreneurs, this will probably resonate with you because I think we tend to be more maybe conceptual thinkers. Like if you imagine yourself right now that you died, right now you die, right? And for a moment, you're able to like look back and try and figure out, okay, if you could just add one more, like your whole life's over, all the different activities you had, all the relationships, all the different things you could have done, all the things you did do, none of those are on the table anymore, but you're able to add like one thing back in, right? You're able to go back and relive or add in like one activity. Like what would that thing be, right? And then to do that sequentially for maybe those top 10 activities or top 10 goals, whatever it is, right? Don't be too rigid with it. Just kind of live into it. I think that that's a really powerful exercise to really help us work out what really, really matters, right? Because there's nothing that sobers us and puts everything in perspective like the endpoint, at least of our life here. And I think that can put things in a really profound perspective. Those are two exercises, both on like a meta level, that can, I think, help you. But again, I've been going now like a mile a minute for 25 minutes or 30 minutes or so. So I'm going to stop, and I just threw a lot out there. So maybe we'll go into like questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, for a lot there. We were taking some notes in the chat, like just some quotes, and I mean we've had trouble typing, like keeping up with just all the good insights and quotes that you've thrown out there that I think we have a lot to chew on. And just a couple of reflections on some of the things you said, like, in the trust in God, I couldn't help but think about, I think it's Pope John the 23rd, who said, he would say, Lord, it's your church. I'm going to bed. It's like, I'm the Pope to run the whole church, but, it's really your church at the end of the day. And it's that to have that trust at the end of the day. And then and please put questions if you have them in the chat. One I'll throw out there is, if one of the themes I kind of what is that balance? How do we find that balance or that integration of trust in God and ascetic hard work and diligence and focus, because there are dangers on either of those extremes, and it takes discernment in that and some self-knowledge, and I know at least it's attributed to St. Ignatius, pray like everything depends on God, and work as everything depends on you. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that discernment for how to navigate that, because it's an easy thing to say, yeah, trust in God and then also work hard. But like, how do we do that practically speaking?
Yeah. I'll try to answer it from like a practical standpoint, but first I'm going to answer it from like my honest opinion that is not like a simple answer necessarily. I think, yesterday we celebrated like the Feast of the Holy Trinity, and I was doing some reading just on like the Holy Spirit, and I'm really convinced that a lot of things, a lot of truths, like just they have to be worked out for us specifically in like a conversation with God over time, and it's just not that simple. Like, it's always attractive to think like you pull this lever and then you pull this lever and then okay, like you got it like all figured out. But I think that for whatever reason, I'm not sure that God actually has designed our world or us to operate that way. I think he wants us to be dependent on relationship with him. And so I think it has to be an ongoing conversation that requires a lot of inner work and listening and reflecting and just a growing sense of awareness about these things. Maybe more practically speaking, I think on one level, and this is more speaking to what I was just saying, but I think being honest about what our natural set point is, right? So like some people are geared, I don't know if this is nature or nurture, but like they're naturally a little more anxious, right? Like, or they're naturally a little more frenetic, right? Like just even like talking to you, John, right? Like you're a little bit more kind of like even keel. And I have been drinking quite a bit of coffee, but I mean, I am like, I get real jazzed up, and that's just like the way I am, right? My natural set point, I have a lot of energy that's kind of always there. And so that's not good or bad. It just is. So I think there's people I know who use the monk manual who really think, hey, this is really helping me to just be more, right? And then I have a friend who I think he struggles to just actually kind of do things that like actually get after stuff, and it kind of pulls him in the other direction. So I think being aware of maybe where you fall in that spectrum might be a good starting point for that conversation. I think that maybe on a really practical standpoint, when you do measure things, whether it's like in the monk manual, it's a fairly simple measurement of just saying, all right, so today I'm going to do these tasks, right? But if I know time blocking doesn't work for everyone. I tend to do a lot of like time blocking. I find that I work best when I can create boundaries to say, all right, I'm going to work during these time periods, and during these time periods, I'm not. And again, like it's an active discernment thing where there's certain things where like something I've been really feeling drawn to lately is I'm trying now to not even bring my computer. I used to go and work on the dining room table sometimes, right? And I found like, I think actually that there's something that happens when I'm bringing this device all these different places. Like it just doesn't feel like it's kind of I'm sensing that there's something really important about being all in, whether you're all in with like family or all in with this or all in with that. You know, another thing, and going on like a little bit of a tangent, but I think this is really interesting and important for people. I at one point started finding that like with my phone, I was really attached to it. And so I ended up getting a burner phone that like no one had the number for except my wife, so that if like an emergency happened, I could still be reached. And I would just leave my phone in my car, and just actually not having my phone on me, even though I wasn't checking it, my mind felt totally different. And I don't know what that is, but there's something to be said about boundaries. And there's something that I think, like I like to think about this a lot, where like our experience as human beings today in 2020, there's so much that we assume is just like what life is like, what it means to be human is like. But I have to imagine like if you're growing up on a farm in like feudal like England, it's just like a totally different thing, right? And so some of these things, I mean, COVID's a good example, right? Like COVID's probably been experienced for many of you to reassess some of your different priorities. How do you work? What are the boundaries in your life? All those things. So John, long story short, I don't have a good answer. I told you I wouldn't be the best, but I'd be honest. So there's me being honest.
No, it's great. No, it's great. And I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the discernment and self-knowledge and, having it infused by the Holy Spirit to be able to navigate that, which there's never going to be a perfect pathway to it. But yeah, thank you. Those are great insights. One other reflection I had about, on this conversation in terms of monastic life is there's, in monastic life, there's not just boundaries for time, but there's also usually boundaries in terms of space, right? So chapel for prayer and encountering God, refectory for meals and community activities. Usually there's even, social rooms or parlors where you meet with external people, so you think of having, so that it can be not just boundarying time, but also space. And it sounds like that's some of what you're doing, and not bringing your computer in the dining room. Like that's a place for family and meals.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that's even really interesting about like the space part is, there's even a real sense of like visual asceticism in like Benedictine spirituality, where like if you go into a room, like there's a reason why there's not tons of art up on the wall or posters or this or that. And I've even tried to like my on my desktop, it's not always like this, but I do have one folder that's just called Be at Peace, and I try and keep everything in that. So on my desktop, there's actually only one thing, and it's just a folder, and then everything's kind of nested inside that. But it's like a little small way I try to live that, right? But it's hard. I mean, not to feel like we're all like victims, but I think this is a really difficult time to be living as, it's a really difficult time to hear God's voice, right? It's like trying to hear God's voice in a club.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll go to so we have some great question in here. So Eric from Coin, how did you balance having family and running a venture? So if we give some color to the question, if we follow Buffett's advice, our ventures probably wouldn't even be the top 5, because getting to heaven, family, etc., would be at the list. So there's guys like Elon Musk where they, run these big companies, and everything is all in on that. But then, these profiles often face divorce and family problems. So how do we think about integrating those things? Or do you have lessons that you've learned from that?
Yeah. I mean, I do think every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else, right? I mean, it's a reality that if I go and I'm having to work at night, like 3 nights a week, which is what I did actually when I was starting the Monk Manual for about a year before I launched it. I mean, I was working nights a lot. And I don't know whether that was right or wrong. I think that there's again a part of like discernment in that. And I think that there's seasons that can tolerate that. So to answer specifically the question around the Warren Buffett exercise, I think one thing that's interesting is if you're laying out like kind of the values, like the high level priorities, and you end up seeing like the venture is not even in the top 5. Still think the exercise was worth it, right? I think that's an interesting anchoring to have. It's maybe worth like putting on a wall somewhere or something like that. But the other piece of it is, so I do think though that, and maybe I didn't express this correctly, but I saw someone linked in the James Clear article on it. My understanding is that it's more so used specifically around like goals or things you want to achieve. So maybe it is the sort of thing where it's like, okay, I want to go and I want to build out the website. I want to go and get my email list to this or that. I want to go and do this, or I want to, and it's forcing you to prioritize in that way. I do think it's harder when you're looking at your whole life, because can you really factor in your whole life as into just 5 things? I'm not sure, but I will say, I mean, I enjoy like thinking in these terms, in that there's a director that I once read an article by. His name's Derek Sion-France. He was raised Catholic. He's no longer active, but he was talking about how like, he's like, at a certain point I worked out, I can really only be good at 3 things. And I've realized I want to be like a great father, a great husband, and a great director. And like, realistically, I know I can't be like a great friend, and I can't be a great this, and I can't be a great that. And I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I do know that's true, that when we try to be everything to everyone, we're really nothing to anyone. I think that there's the holiest people I've known are very, I don't know, they're very focused, I think. So.
Okay. Great. Any in terms of maybe things that you found helpful in terms of integrating family life with your work? I mean, you have a family, and you also, you work very hard, and you're an entrepreneur, and you've been successful at it. Like things that you brought up some points in this conversation, but I don't know if there are any other things that may come to mind that you want to share.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you this is tied to the laptop thing, and this is maybe not so much advice as it is a point of discernment, or where I felt like it was really kind of off the rails a bit. Is when I would work downstairs, one of the reasons that I was like, I felt like I had to go and not be working so much around family is, I just felt like every time my kids saw me, and they would, because kids, at least my kids, the ages they're at, I mean, every time they see me, they're like, "Hey, it's Dad. Like, I want to go and spend some time with Dad," right? And every time, like, I'm in it. I'm working on something, and it's like, no, not. Like, I don't want to be distracted, and I feel like I was communicating to them, like, you're a distraction me, or like, this is more important than you are, right? Like, this email is more important right now than you are, and so I just wanted to kind of create more of a boundary around that, to say, like, I don't want to have those instances, right? I'd much rather have an experience of being kind of all in with whatever I'm doing. This is another somewhat it's somewhat theoretical, somewhat practical, and I'm still working through it. But one of the things I have struggled with, because I think this is maybe natural as an entrepreneur, is like, where do you draw the line? Like, where do you draw the boundary, right? Because I could go and work 60 hours a week. I could go and work 70 hours a week, right? My wife stays home. In theory, if I wanted to go and, I mean, we could sustain even maybe more than that. And what are we giving up? What am I sacrificing? How's that affect the relationship? All these things. And some of that's like discernment. Some of that's paying attention to what is the state of my wife, of the relationship, of my kids, and trying to live into that. But I do think, and again, I haven't like put a bow on this, but I've thought about it quite a bit, that if you look at someone like Mother Teresa, for example, I just use this because she's like a common person everyone knows. I imagine that Mother Teresa could have a more profound and lasting impact and transformative impact on someone over a half-hour period than potentially someone else could spending like 40 hours, right? And so part of it is like, how do you go and figure out how to really optimize or create impact in a way where, like if I know I'm going to have to sacrifice in some way, or my kids aren't going to, like I'm going to be working like one night, I think the counterbalance has to be like the time that I am there. I have to really, really be there, right? I have to really, I have to kind of be all in. And I think those things can compensate. The exact formula, though, there's so many shifting things, like my wife stays home. If she was working, what would that look like? If I had 5 kids, what would that look like? If I had no kids, what would that look like? If it's just a really difficult thing. And I also know, like, frankly, like, to be totally honest, like last year, I mean, I was really stressed at certain points, right? Like I was in the beginning phases of trying to get something off the ground, and maybe it's my lack of faith. I mean, it is my lack of faith on some level, but I mean, I was really feeling like I have to really hustle right now. Like I have to really get after this, because it's going to cause a lot of stress otherwise. And my wife and I were kind of on the same page there, and we tried to do our best. And I mean, that's kind of what it is, I guess,
Yeah.
These aren't great answers, but again,
no, it's the reality, and there's a lot of color and nuance to it. And no, we appreciate your insights and your honesty. It's a question here. What did your, so some people in this group are going full time, and some are, part time on their project. So this could be a relevant question for folks. What did your discernment look like from going from dynamic Catholic to monk manual full time, especially with a family and a good job?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I have a number of friends who are also entrepreneurs, and they talk to me actually quite a bit about these sort of things, because a lot of people in a space trying to figure out when's the right time, when should I be doing this. I probably spent about a year working on the Monk Manual, and without getting into too much detail, at a certain point, I started feeling like God was calling me to something else, right? And over time, it became more and more clear that that was the case. But I wish I could kind of like, I can't layer my exact experience on anyone else's, because for me specifically, the calling was like very, very clear. Like it was just very clear to me that like I'm basically being called to do this specific thing. And so I wasn't having to work through so much of the discernment of whether I should be doing it or not. It was more a matter of like, how should it work and when should it work? And because I had a good job, and because I knew I could do well in my work, and I didn't have any ethical concerns because I was really cautious about not using like company devices or working at work, things like that. I thought, there's an impulse that sometimes says, oh, I got to just burn the ships and just go and do this. And I understand that. But oftentimes what ends up happening is what a job provides you is a freeing from being living in a tyranny of short-term concerns and optimization, right? Like if you know you have a family and you really have to go and make cash like very quick, you're going to be optimizing everything for short term. And I do believe that generally speaking, you're trading off. It's hard to find things where it's like short term optimize and long term optimize like simultaneously. I mean, there's things that exist, but and so what you're doing is then you're actually kind of stagnating some of that long term growth because you're having to focus on the short term. So in some ways, if you're already in a job and if you can kind of tolerate that tension and try to get to a place where you really have as much work done as possible that you can do before you need to make the leap. That would be my advice every time, because I think that having that sense of security enables you to dream a little bit bigger. It enables you to take a little bit bigger risks in your strategy. But then at a certain point, it will come time for you to make that leap. And again, like so many factors involved in that. But I guess practically speaking, and everyone in this group, I don't actually know what everyone's model is here. For me, I had some security in knowing I felt like I really understood the audience. I feel like I understood the model. I feel like I knew other products in similar spaces and how that all worked. And so I was like, I feel pretty confident this is going to work. And I also knew, okay, there's this model called Kickstarter. And if it doesn't work, I'll go and be able to, I'll be in a position where I have to go and figure something out, but I'll know that pretty quickly. So trying to figure out how you're in a scenario where, because really what you're doing is you're leaping off, right? You're leaping off a cliff in some ways with like a hang glider. So you need to like make sure that hang glider actually can fly to the best of your ability. You also need to make sure there's enough like wind, there's an audience for what you're doing. And then this is where the analogy maybe breaks down, but like probably trying to find a way where you can figure out if it's going to work or not as soon as possible, so that you can kind of compensate if you need to, right? And it does change because like if someone's, for example, building a software platform, there's different dynamics there than more of like a service-based thing or like a ministry-based thing. But yeah, I would say like, as an entrepreneur, I'm actually fairly risk adverse, I think, comparatively to other entrepreneurs I know. So I'm the person who's going to be like putting my foot on the floor to make sure, okay, is this going to give out? Is this not? I might do it like 10 times before I step, right? So yeah, my natural intuition though says as much as you can to try and eliminate the risk up front before you leap, just because it's, yeah, I mean, one other point, I know I'm rambling a little bit here, but I do think it's also incredibly important for people who are married. Like you cannot underestimate the X factor of your relationship with your spouse. Like if your spouse really has to be on board with it, because like there's going to be enough stress from the business itself, let alone the stress that potentially could happen in the marriage if like you're feeling like there's a lot of tension there. And I think inevitably entrepreneurship does lead to some of that, right? Like there's going to be times where because frankly, I think a lot of times entrepreneurs, like we tend to attract opposites, right? So you might be more risk prone, your spouse might be more risk adverse. So, I mean, those things are going to come to a head in one way or another. So even walking with your spouse and not being it's something where it's like, okay, come follow me, but say like, let's walk into this together is really important.
Great. Great insights here. So we're coming close to time. There's just a quick question here about if you have any tips for quick Kickstarter campaigns, or if there are any resources you found that maybe we could be willing to share with the people here for that.
Sure. Yeah. So really, really quick. I think one of the things is Kickstarter always sounds really great from the outside because you see like a lot of the successes. And I think it is a great platform. What it's a great platform for is actually building an initial audience. It's not necessarily the most effective to spin up a lot of cash. If you added up all the time I spent on the Monk Manual prior to the Kickstarter and during the Kickstarter, I raised like $72,000. I probably got paid $2 an hour, right? Like realistically for all the time I put into it. But that wasn't the reason I was doing it. The reason I was doing it was because I knew it was the best way to go and bring something to market in a fairly quick way and test out everything. So I think knowing that that's, if you want to do that, I think that's a really good channel for that. There's a ton of articles online about Kickstarters, successful ones. Actually, there's a guy by the name of Mike Del Ponte who is a Catholic entrepreneur that maybe he's already been on here. I don't know, but I saw John smiling, so maybe he knows him. But he had it's funny because he had a really successful Kickstarter. It was actually on like Tim Ferriss's blog for it. And I actually kind of like looked up to him, and I've connected with him after the fact, but he's a Catholic as well, had a really successful Kickstarter. One of his article actually is probably one of the best that's out there on Kickstarter, but there's a few really good ones. The Best Version Planner, I think it's called. They talk about their Kickstarter. You piece these things together. I think a big thing is building up an email list. That's a really, really big thing, going in, running some different ads, things like that. So.
Great. Thanks for the insight, Steve. This is just a wonderful conversation. So big thanks to you for making time and sharing your wisdom with this group. And I think we'll call it a wrap there, but we just want to say thank you so much again for being here. And it's been a wonderful session, Steve. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you guys, and good luck on this next chapter for each of you.
Thank you so much. And you too.
All right. God bless. Take care.
God bless. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Steve.
And for anyone